If you've been tuning into my channel, you know I've already covered the meaning of Pluto, how Pluto got its character, and Pluto in every house of the wheel. I'm going to look at Pluto from one more perspective, and that is how Pluto transits have changed life in the West. We'll look at Pluto as it moves through a sign and see the traits of that sign expressed on a very large scale. We see shifting events, behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. We see different priorities and different concerns. Each Pluto transit creates what the Germans call a zeitgeist, or a dominant spirit of the time. This is a retrospective. I'm beginning with Pluto in Gemini and ending with Pluto in Sagittarius. Pluto in Sag is the last transit that Pluto completed, and so it's the last one I can speak of in the past tense. Pluto spends an average of 20 years in a sign. However, due to a highly elliptical orbit, the time it takes in a sign varies considerably. Also, because of retrogrades while changing signs, dates can be very messy here. For this reason, I'm rounding out Pluto's dates of entry and exit to the nearest year. From here on, this presentation is audio only. Over each transit, there's a still shot that shows the generation I'm addressing and the years Pluto was in that sign. Let's begin with the first transit that included the theory of Pluto and the search for Pluto. It also embodies what a space-age person thinks of as the modern world. Pluto in Gemini, 1885 to 1914. We know that Pluto stands for massive change and transformation, and we know that the air sign Gemini operates in the mental realm. So transformations in society took place primarily in the realm of ideas. Pluto in Gemini was a turn of the century era famous for a flurry of innovation and new thought. If you had an idea, an improvement on an idea, something that you engineered and wanted to patent, the West was the place to be. Gemini is associated with details and fragments, not the big picture. And one of the things about this era was that ideas were like a scaffold onto which other people welded little bits and pieces. The car began as 4 wheels, a seat, and an engine. Then another person got a patent for a windshield, and someone else for a windshield wiper, and someone else for a headlight, and someone else for a stop sign and a traffic light. Any Gemini, anyone with significant Gemini in their chart, knows this feeling of ideas spinning off each other, growing spontaneously, even scattering. When Pluto entered Gemini, the U.S. Patent Office had only issued 10,000 patents in total since 1791. The number of patents issued while Pluto was in Gemini was 500,000. We got everything from the smoke detector to the swivel chair to the Ferris wheel. This ingenious sign is specifically associated with messaging. The twins in Greco-Roman myth are always looking for each other. They fly around the earth seeking each other, seeking the other half of the connection. And when the twins see each other for a few minutes each day, they use the time to pass notes. So Pluto in Gemini inspired a time when the focus was on getting the message across, connecting people so that the masses could share a new experience of the world. In terms of advances, Pluto in Gemini oversaw a sudden leap. Society went from a horse and buggy to manned flights over bodies of water, and even to the very first dogfights in battle. Advances in flight make all the sense in the world when it comes to Pluto in Gemini. Mercury, the ruling god of Gemini, is a flying god. In the myth of the twins, in fact, their father, Jupiter, mates with their mother while disguised as a bird. That says Gemini is part bird, and so it was, of course, going to shoot for the sky. But we didn't just see flight. We saw flights of fancy and the flights of ideas. Let's add a couple of important individuals to the mix. The modern world was deeply affected by two famous inventors, Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell. Bell and Edison were both born in 1847. They were exactly the right age at exactly the right time to add a great deal to Pluto in Gemini. They were young enough to be modern thinkers, but old enough to be established in their fields when it came time for the rush of inventions. Post-Civil War thinking was all about reaching out, illuminating the world, connecting the world, messaging across the world, exchanging ideas, building on ideas, and adapting to an ever more restless, urbanized population. Gemini is the most social sign, so it's no surprise that dealing with a dense, expanding population would be a main project of this transit. Mobility is also at the core of Gemini. It has to move. So Pluto in Gemini brought more ways to be mobile. It brought better and more reliable cars, more paved roads, a passenger subway, elevated trains, gas-powered buses, and safety bicycles that could be used on the streets because they finally had good tires and reliable brakes. Also remember that Gemini prefers thinking over laboring. It thinks about quickening what was slow. It's also not terribly fond of sitting for hours doing the same boring thing. Therefore, a lot of the inventions of this transit were quickening, labor-saving devices. Take the electric dishwasher, the vacuum, the electric iron, the oven, and even early refrigerators. This sign prefers play to work, and so it often uses its ingenuity to free up time. There's also an association between Gemini and youth that goes all the way back to ancient Greece. Gemini is not associated with what we call young childhood, mind you. Young childhood has an on-self-conscious vitality that rests with the sign of Leo. Youth, for our purposes, means that time in life when a young person can survive without the protection and supervision of parents. When Pluto moved into Gemini, there was a societal change in how the young were viewed and what responsibilities should be given at what age. Prior to Pluto in Gemini, youth was not valued. The young regularly worked long shifts in factories, and the age of consent in most places was just 11. Pluto in Gemini brought these ideas to the table, and all around the country, the age of consent was raised to 16. And there was something else, something quite transformative. Just weeks after Pluto moved into Gemini, the national government created the Education Act of 1885, which made education compulsory. The young were now required to attend school. Pluto in Gemini established the idea that youth and adulthood are different times in life that should come with different pressures. This intellectual transit also brought the idea that literacy creates a better, more organized, more peaceful society. The average person should be able to read was now the overwhelming attitude. Gemini always ends up in the realm of ideas, so this was the era wherein people went to the drawing board and began creating a framework for compulsory ed. Leave it to the intellectual god Mercury to create an intellectual zeitgeist. And the messenger god brought all manner of messaging innovations. Under Alexander Graham Bell, the first transcontinental call occurred, connecting New York and San Francisco. That connection was a major advance. Two-way communication across a vast distance said something about where we as a society would go. That call was the nascent stirring of what we have today. During this transit, we got the first moving images. Soon, the first movies played at the cinema. Ticker tapes were also born, giving the masses the same information at exactly the same time. Then we got the first wireless radio waves. Mercury's dream was coming to fruition. Words, speech, language were all floating through the air. But what about the telephone? And what about the illuminating power of the light bulb? These were extremely important inventions. Well, they didn't coincide with Pluto in Gemini. They were created before Pluto hit Gemini. But what did coincide with this transit is the mass distribution of telephones and lights. Pluto is interested in the masses, in blanketing people with sweeping change. So Pluto doesn't care much if a light bulb or telephone is sitting in some inventor's lab. Pluto cares about getting it into the hands of the masses so a collective experience can begin. Early electricity, for instance, was only available to a few. Wires hung down from the ceiling like an octopus. Wires ran through fabric and across carpets. It was dangerous and only available to the very wealthy. Likewise, it relied on flighty private utility companies. Plugs and sockets weren't standardized, so the oven you bought might plug in or might not, and if it did, the utility company might not service it. Electric lamps were available for quite some time, but they used such expensive parts that the masses of people couldn't afford them. Pluto in Gemini inspired Thomas Edison to find a different filament to make a bulb that was safe, cheap, and available. Now everyone could use it. And suddenly a brand new industry arose, citywide utility and power companies that would install incandescent lighting on a large scale. Then we got to see society quicken even more. The electric bulb allowed the masses to keep working and playing and living through the night. The incandescent bulb brought a new flexibility to the Western world. Now society could be as active and restless as it really was, and at all hours. When Pluto was in Gemini, telephones became part of the national consciousness because they finally got into the hands of the people and they began to serve the general public. They could be found in hotels and restaurants, train stations, grocery stores, and even on street corners. By the time Pluto exited Gemini, there were 100,000 standardized public payphones in the United States. Pluto represents power. There's nothing powerful about one phone. It only becomes powerful when there are many. That's when the phone can affect society at large. Pluto in Gemini was an extremely dynamic and flexible time intellectually and educationally. This era was about solving problems that spontaneously arose from an urbanizing population. It was also an era dedicated to both innovation and tackling the problems that came from those very innovations. And this brings us to the dark side of Pluto in Gemini, what I call the unexamined manic flurry of ideas. It's in the nature of Gemini to split in two. Then they see the light twin, but not the dark twin. They say they're the happy twin, but never the miserable twin. It's important for every Gemini to get acquainted with their dark side, and it's smart to consider the dark manifestation of everything new coming into society under Pluto in Gemini. After all, the first controlled flight of an aircraft was not far off from the first plane used in a military battle. The first car wasn't far off from the first case of vehicular homicide. Everything Gemini created had the potential to be both light and dark, and it would have been nice if it had been seen that way from the start. But this was certainly an exciting time. We can imagine what magic it was for the first people who watched the first movies on the silver screens, and what a thrill it must have been to drive the first motor cars, or even to use the first ballpoint pen. But this transit was followed by Pluto in the complex and emotional sign of Cancer, which brought a more difficult, serious tone to the Western world. Pluto in Cancer, 1914 to 1939. Pluto is about transformation, struggle, and power. The sign Cancer is associated with home, family, security, defense, roots, and clan. So when Pluto transited Cancer, we saw transformations in all of these aspects of life. Let's start with security and defense. When it comes to Cancer, security refers to all kinds, from emotional security to physical security to financial security. In other words, Cancer is the most safety-oriented sign of the zodiac. Something about being ruled by the fluctuating moon causes this sign to look for stability and safety in the outer world. The crab is mostly defensive by nature. Were it not for that defensive shell, there would be no crab at all, just a pile of mush. So one thing you can rely on is that the crab will defend itself once disturbed. We saw this in World War I, the war to end all wars. When Pluto moved into Cancer, America was sitting in its shell, unbothered. Across the pond, a soap opera of old resentments and new conflicts split Europe into two coalitions. The official word of Woodrow Wilson was that the U.S. would be neutral. But like a crab walking sideways, Wilson was sending raw materials and supplies to Britain. Nourishing Britain was not exactly a magnanimous act. Wartime production was helping a recession in America. Meanwhile, Europe was on its knees and bleeding out. In the US, popular opinion was still to remain neutral. That is until Germany torpedoed US supply ships and then went further, sinking passenger ships. With the killing of American civilians, mass opinion turned sharply. Defense was in order. Soon 4 million men were armed and on the ground. This war was the event that caused many of the transformations in society that I'll talk about, including the role of the mother and women in general. At this time, women changed drastically. They took traditionally male jobs. They became bus drivers, coal heavers, shipbuilders, mechanics, police officers, bankers. They worked with dangerous poisons, gases, explosives, and shells. The work was grueling. The hours were long. Women were covered in poisons at the end of the day. All the stereotypes about what women were capable of were challenged during this transit. It was difficult after that to convince women that they were too delicate, fragile, and confused to vote or go to college. This was a sweeping Cancerian social change in the United States. In Europe, however, World War I had laid waste to everything: families, villages, cities, businesses, farms, factories, and industry. Europe slipped into starvation and chaos. That brings us to the next major change associated with Pluto in Cancer. This is the sign of home and what people feel is their home and their roots. The devastation of World War I resulted in a huge rise in immigration in the United States. Many Europeans had no other choice. Their roots were blown out from under them. Granted, people had been coming over for decades, but Pluto in Cancer brought a spike, what might be referred to today as a tipping point. By the time Pluto was in 3 degrees of Cancer, 75% of New Yorkers were either immigrants or first generation. Cancer is a clannish sign due to its high security needs, and Pluto tends to see everything as a battle for survival. So as Pluto moved through Cancer, xenophobia began to rise. Many white middle-class Americans thought the U.S. had become an uncontrolled melting pot of religions and backgrounds. Many Europeans were too dark-skinned for comfort. Blacks had just been freed and were living public lives. On top of that, women were talking in public about the vote and about birth control. In short, the world had turned upside down. This brings us to the underbelly, the undertow of people who wanted to go back to the way things used to be. So the Ku Klux Klan experienced a revival in the United States. This new generation of the Klan actually felt that they had more to be afraid of. They weren't just anti-Black. They added Catholics, Jews, labor activists, communists. By the time Pluto was halfway through Cancer, the Klan had drawn 4 million official members. They walked down the streets of Washington, D.C. with little black dolls hanging from kite strings, and of course they burned crosses on people's lawns to show their Christian love. Luckily, the rise of the Klan also fell again during the Great Depression. Here we go back to the security Cancer craves, and we see the extremes that Pluto brings. While Pluto was in Cancer from 1914 to 1939, we saw the wealth of the roaring 20s plummet into unemployment and poverty on a massive scale. When the stock market crashed in 1929 and the banks folded, security disappeared for a huge swath of the population. Soup lines formed, and cardboard villages sprang up in every city. Add the Dust Bowl that caused farms to go belly up, and there was an entire decade where the focus was on what there was to eat and drink, and where exactly people would migrate. Millions of people left their homes for the sake of survival. Let's talk about something else, something big and plutonic: the government. The government can always be seen as a parental force. Citizens are children. Sometimes they're neglected, sometimes exploited, and sometimes taken care of from cradle to grave. When Pluto was in Cancer, the relationship between government and citizen changed in the United States. Government began exerting an influence it never had before. So during Pluto in Cancer, the government became more parental. For instance, the New Deal gave the unemployed jobs to do because the private sector wasn't doing it. Farmers were paid to keep their land inactive. Pluto in the sign of security brought social security. Money and food were simply handed out to the needy. A minimum wage was implemented so labor couldn't be exploited during desperate times. Likewise, profit limits were placed on big business. It was a serious moment that required serious measures, and with Pluto in the maternal sign of Cancer, the government got into large-scale nourishment. The problem is that when Cancer nurtures, there's usually some control underneath that love. So we also saw government overstep its bounds via prohibition. Like a parent who says, "No, you can't have that." Alcohol was made illegal. Supposedly, it was to protect the family because alcoholism was on the rise. Drunken fathers were considered a disease in society. A drunken man was, in the cartoons and art of the time, always shown as an abuser, a criminal, and a bum. Ads for prohibition often showed children holding signs asking for a sober daddy. Let's continue to talk about family. Parents and children are a major theme for the sign of Cancer. And yes, a lot of changes went on in the American family during this transit. Most people were now aiming for a love marriage. Rather than being a hierarchical and patriarchal structure, it started to become a partnership where parents were, ideally, going to be both friends and lovers. This had a lot to do with women getting the right to vote and, after their work in World War I, being seen as a contributing part of society. Some of it also had to do with romantic films in which heartthrobs like Rudolph Valentino starred. There was a lot of romance in pop culture and in the writing of the time. When it comes to children, family size was reducing. Why? Well, birth control was becoming available, and more women were using it so that they were free to work outside the home. The other factor that added to this scenario was an urban population. In rural societies, each kid can be seen as an asset, a farmhand. As societies industrialize, children become economic liabilities. But you can add a few more items. For instance, this was also a time when more women were putting off marriage in order to attend college. They didn't just want a job. For the first time, they were thinking about a career, even in law and medicine. Female public figures like Marie Curie and Willa Cather were giving women real-world role models who rose on their own merits. Role models are a major psychological force. Seeing people who look like you in positions of influence makes all the difference in what an individual assumes that she can do. During the crash and the Great Depression, family size continued to dwindle, though poverty was the main motivator now. Men especially were staying single until they had a financial foothold, and that cushion was taking longer to build than it ever had before. Pluto stands for hypervigilance and control. The sign of Cancer stands for family. So during Pluto's transit through Cancer, we saw new controls in the family unit. The maternal sign of Cancer transformed both motherhood and womanhood. Women wanted a less subservient role in the family. Men wanted more money so they could provide a better life. This transit was one full of fluctuations financially and in terms of security. There were fluctuations in governmental powers as well. It's most remembered as a difficult and serious time, a time focused on defense, immigration, forced migration, survival, and clannishness. And in many ways, it sits in striking contrast to Pluto in the next sign of the zodiac, vital, abundant, fun-loving Leo. Pluto in Leo, 1939 to 1958. In Europe, a continent still devastated by the First World War, a fascist government arose in Germany. Propaganda films and a mass media machine spoke with one voice. That voice made Adolf Hitler into a godlike figure and Germans into a master race. Hitler only needed more land in order to breed the master race, So he began invading countries and taking their territory. The United States kept up with his actions, even listening to a live radio broadcast of Hitler's army invading Austria. But after the losses of World War I, Americans were not interested in getting involved in another European war. So Hitler went on with his plan to create a completely Aryan, totally German world. He just had to exterminate Jews and anyone who didn't fit into his eugenic utopia and anyone who disagreed. In Hitler, we actually see a perfect example of the underbelly of Pluto and Leo. This is the darkest of examples, of course, a megalomaniac rising into the spotlight, saying he and his people are special, putting out only one opinion, and taking whatever he wanted, no matter who suffered or who died. In Hitler, you don't just see the narcissism of Leo and the power-hungry drive of Pluto. You can also see psychopathy and mass murder, which generally isn't part of Pluto and Leo's shadow, but was in his case. For the U.S., neutrality was no longer possible because a few months after Pluto moved into Leo for good, the Japanese, allied with Germany and Italy, bombed an American fleet at Pearl Harbor, and just 4 days later, Germany officially declared war on the United States. Americans felt sandwiched between a threat from the East and a threat from the West. And this is what was needed to unleash a wrath that had been dormant for a decade. During the 1930s, America was like a crab hiding in its hole. But now Pluto was in Leo. Leo can't be dormant and it can't hide. The lion needs to shine. And at the core of Leo is a deep desire for purpose. The United States took the Second World War as its purpose, and that changed everything. In a few short years, it created not just a world power, but the first world superpower. The sign associated with pride created a zeitgeist in which people came forward in massive numbers volunteering for service. There was a republic to defend, a republic that was, in leonine fashion, considered unique since its earliest days. If farmers and blacksmiths could win independence from the English Empire, an industrialized America could crush one fascist government. This hugely productive, well-engineered but withering society was again lifting its fiery wings. For the Second World War, America began mass-producing rations, weapons, and medical supplies on a scale never seen before. The size of the population, the number of available laborers, and the pool of scientists who now had something to work on all coalesced. The Depression was over. American manufacturing was in full shine again, only better. Soon the U.S. had the most well-trained army in the world, with every branch showing off innovation and invention. The U.S. could adapt to any type of fighting in any environment. Private peacetime factories were changed into wartime production lines. Lionel trains built battleships, car makers built guns, and America overwhelmed the enemy. For the first time in a long time, America was vital and alive, center stage, and in the spotlight. Another interesting thing about this time was that all resources were called upon. Fire signs go all in, and that is also how the greatness of Leo is tapped. Every Leo who has searched for the actualized self knows that it takes all of you. Fulfillment means wholeness. So the U.S. tapped into everyone, men and women, blacks and whites, the old and the young. Everyone stood for the same ideal. With this unity and national pride, they took out the bad guy. They fought and they won against an obvious evil. Nothing makes the fire signs happier than to conquer an enemy. Let's talk now about the bombing of Hiroshima in August of 1945, the event that ended the war. Leo, we know, is ruled by the sun. Amazingly, the hydrogen bomb was brighter than the sun. In the center of that nuclear explosion was a heat hotter than the surface of the sun. Pluto in Leo brought the sun to Earth, and in a blaze of death ended the bloodiest battle in military history. Europe and Japan were decimated. The United States was reborn. It was flying high with no competition at the time. That feels like an ending, but Pluto was still only at 10 degrees of Leo. So what was the rest of the transit about? The post-war time was considered a good and confident time, a time of peace and a time of extreme prosperity. Americans had been through 2 world wars and the Depression. They were thinking about a better life. Veterans were given a stimulus of sorts to get going. That meant preferential treatment when it came to civilian jobs, home loans, business loans, farm loans, and the GI Bill, which would pay for any college degree. Marriage rates rose, and then came the baby boom. Leo is the sign associated with children and the inner child. Remember, Leo loves to see its reflection, like Narcissus at the pond, and Leo loves play. Play is how Leo finds the self. That baby boom meant millions and millions of new people. All the new people needed dwellings. This transit brought an era in which it was cheaper to buy a home than rent a city apartment. And this is how the suburbs were born. Most families had a car, so it was no longer essential to live close to work, and a suburban home could be put up in just a few days. Mass production now meant mass-produced houses where just a few floor plans went on for miles. The architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, referred to the suburbs as a colossal display of bad taste. That's true, but a product being stimulating to the soul is unimportant in a consumer society, and that was the cost of creating a huge middle class. Wages were excellent at the time, and after a spike in divorce right after the war, families were now generally intact, and millions of new suburban children had a safe place to grow up. There were streets to skate and bike on, kids to play with, and parks to play in. This is when spending on children nearly rose to modern levels. Pluto in Leo brought an expert named Dr. Benjamin Spock, a pediatrician who had a great deal of influence in child rearing. Spare the rod, spoil the child was replaced by a new belief in a flexible, softer touch. Children, he said, should be treated as individuals. Individuality is key for Leo, and seeing this on a massive scale is to be expected when Pluto is in Leo. He advised candy, good health care, toys, and positive reinforcement. He also mentioned that the maternal instinct within every mother would tell her what to do if she listened to it. Going inside would yield the answer. That is just what Parsifal found in the myth associated with Leo. The lion's mantra is, know thyself. So what the individual wanted in general became more important during this transit. Leo is prone to pride and performance. They're never afraid to flash what they've earned. So the spirit of this time was to buy stuff, show it off, spend money on amusements. The automobile certainly provided a lot of opportunities for people to have fun. Leo, don't forget, is associated with romance and dating. Cars made unchaperoned dating easy. You could swing by and pick up your date. You could go to the malt shop, play the jukebox, hang at the diner, go to the drive-in, or go up to Lover's Lane. Transistors made radios small, so now music was portable. This was a time of breakthrough music, especially due to Elvis, who was the leader of rock and roll. And let's not forget the doo-wop bands like the Drifters and the Platters that made modern dancing a national pastime. But then there was the biggest amusement of all, the television. Television allowed people to leave their minds behind and fall into a different world. Watching TV causes the brain to go into alpha waves, a pleasurable state of hypnosis. During this transit, the habit of vegging out in front of the television was born. This brings us to the pitfalls of Leo, an emphasis on pleasure seeking and feeling entitled to follow whims. People had money. They were focused on amusement. They were thinking about what they wanted, and they were buying toys. Leo is about the self. Naturally, the darker side of that is consumption and egoism. There's another, less obvious, darker side of Pluto and Leo. Pluto is power. Its underbelly is the misuse of power. And in Leo, that misuse was against the individual. This comes across in a striking way during the Red Scare, a time when there was social paranoia against communism infiltrating the United States. A senator named McCarthy put people through hearings to determine if they were sufficiently loyal to the U.S. government. The Un-American Activities Committee investigated allegations in both the government and the Hollywood film industry. During this period, individuals could not have thoughts that deviated from what McCarthy approved of. The frightening part of this era was that a little gossip here, a whisper there about being subversive could actually end a career. Segments of the government were acting like a police state, and only one opinion was allowed. You might see some parallels between this behavior and fascist Germany. This kind of toxic bullying is one of the dark facets of Pluto and Leo. Next, Pluto moved into Virgo, which brought a deep intellectual analysis of society and a transformation of our social systems. Pluto in Virgo, 1958 to 1971. Virgo is the intellectual earth sign. It's about analyzing, pulling the moving parts together, creating systems. It's also charged with the streamlining and perfecting of those systems. In other words, Virgo is designed to see problems, be it the loose thread, the misused word, or the disenfranchised group of people. In the sign of Virgo, Pluto did a deep dive into what was wrong with the social systems of the United States. Pluto in Virgo came during an era when a lot of the population was oppressed, be it for their gender, their skin tone, or their sexual orientation. These problems were centuries old, so a fix would not be easy. But Pluto in Virgo began as Virgo always begins, bit by bit. As I've said before, each sign of the zodiac corrects for the excesses of the sign that came before, and each Pluto generation does that too. Pluto in Leo had overseen the creation of the suburbs and a consumer society. Pluto in Virgo said, hey, it might not be about the individual alone. It might be about helping others. With the power planet in the sign of the woman who belongs to no one and stands alone, it might be about everyone's independence. Virgo is uncomfortable with privilege. This hard-working, conscientious sign believes in meritocracy, and that is not what was going on. Wages were not equal for women or blacks. Access to jobs was restricted, and working conditions were often subpar. Access to public places was restricted for blacks and sometimes women, and being gay was still considered a mental illness. Now, civil rights are an interesting topic. Some people are free to do whatever they want. Others are told in one way or another that they ought to sit down, shut up, and just understand that their bank account is never going to be full. People suffer discrimination and disrespect for hundreds of years, and then there is a breaking point. It's hard to predict when that moment will happen. The day Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on the bus, she hadn't planned that. She said in a radio interview that she suddenly had a quilt of determination around her. At that moment, she was sick and tired of giving in, and there was no going back. Another key event in civil rights happened at Stonewall Inn. Stonewall was supposed to be a safe haven in a country where homosexuality was illegal in every state. But gays were harassed by cops there regularly. They were beaten, they were rounded up and brought to jail for anything the cops could think of. One night, the cops busted through the door of Stonewall, and two Puerto Rican drag queens at the center of the action said, "No, no more." And the Stonewall riots began. People stuffed the cops into the bar and set it on fire. Those cops escaped out the back, but supporters crowded the sidewalks, and those riots dragged on for 5 days. A year later, the first gay pride parade marched down that very street. In Greensboro, 4 students sat down at the lunch counter at Woolworth's. The official policy was to refuse service to blacks, so those 4 didn't get lunch, but they refused to leave. They stayed put until the store closed and then returned the next day with more black students from nearby colleges. Only now the local media and supportive protesters were there. Day after day, they sat at that counter, and protesters stood outside with their picket signs. How long did it take to get their lunch? 5 months. Pluto's transformations were going to take time, detail by detail, hour by hour, day by day. But this is one of Virgo's strengths. In service to self and society, this sign searches for what works, not what it would be nice to see work, not what it hopes will work, but what actually works. This is why Virgo is known as the experimenter of the zodiac. In order to find out what works, you have to put a little bit of everything in the petri dish. Pluto in Virgo ushered in the Civil Rights Act, which banned both discrimination and segregation, but none of this was easy, and there were plenty of tragic, untimely deaths along with the advances. The Freedom Riders got blown up on their way to New Orleans to integrate interstate busing. 4 innocent girls got blown up during a church service in Birmingham. When Martin Luther King went there to integrate the city, initially it looked like he failed, but something powerful was happening. Television broadcasts brought the violence of the Jim Crow South to Northerners. They watched violence against women and children and men whose only crime was being Black and standing on the sidewalk. Pluto exposes secrets, and that footage exposed the truth about police violence and attack dogs and water cannons. John Kennedy saw it, and he finally endorsed the goals of the civil rights movement. The March on Washington, where King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, had an effect in part because of the enormous size of the protest, and everyone was getting in on it. There were demonstrations of women, Latinos, Native Americans, gays, Blacks, environmentalists, and anti-war activists. People were pissed, and so at times things flew out of control. Windows were broken and cop cars were smashed. Tear gas was thrown into the crowds, and riots became an ugly part of society. Remember, Pluto stands for extremes, so a streak of conservatism cropped up in the country too. Pluto in Virgo was allowing people on both sides to see all this going down on television. That had a huge psychological impact. And now we're back to the thing we always discuss in talking about Pluto: mass media. There was a sharp change between the television of Pluto in Leo and that of Pluto in Virgo. During Pluto in Leo, I Love Lucy and the Mickey Mouse Club were designed to whisk people out of their workaday world. When Pluto entered the realistic sign of Virgo, the trend was to show reality. Almost every American household had a television by now as well. Yes, this intellectual sign gave us things like presidential debates and tours of the White House. But Pluto in Virgo also brought the first rape story to the news, the first murder, footage of bombs going off at the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. Cold War tensions covered both channels. Viewers watched as ballistic missiles were pointed at the state of Florida. The news started to become a place where real-world violence and stress and danger were all portrayed every single day. Then there was the day that some nice footage of a car ride in Dallas turned into a presidential assassination. I asked a baby boomer what that was like. She said, "We knew presidents had been shot before, but we had never seen anything like that. Everyone loved John Kennedy. Walter Cronkite could barely croak out the announcement. It was one thing for the president to be shot. It was another to watch the top of his skull hit Jackie's suit. Our senator said, 'We'll laugh again, but we'll never be young again.' That was true. It was more than an assassination. It was a loss of our innocence." In the myth of Pluto and Persephone, that is exactly what happens to the young maiden. She's pulled into the underworld where, in the darkness, she loses her innocence. She can see the sunlight again, but she can never be that young maiden again. Pluto in Virgo did this to Americans on a massive scale through the assassination of JFK. Then Robert Kennedy was killed, and Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. The leaders people believed in were gone, and it was all happening under the umbrella of a nuclear standoff. This was reality, yes, but the underbelly of Pluto in Virgo is the tendency to package a bunch of problems together and call it the only reality. And my opinion has always been that humans aren't designed to digest knowledge in this way. The human mind is made to deal with what's going on in the cave and in the village, local problems over which we have some control. Pluto in Virgo brought a very big and problematic world into the homes of individuals who couldn't do much except feel unsettled and anxious. One frightening story juxtaposed against another can bring in what I call open-ended anxiety. That means anxiety with no outlet and no resolution. And yet, Pluto in Virgo's reality wasn't all bad. The world of technological advance was growing exponentially. This can best be seen on two fronts. Firstly, Pluto in Virgo is where the pharmaceutical industrial complex came into being. Along with advances in medicine came big money for the formulation of drugs. Stress was rising, and industry responded with pill after pill. Valium and Librium came shortly after the masses were shaken by the Cuban Missile Crisis. America became a pill-popping society on the one hand, and yet on the other, mental and emotional and psychiatric illnesses that were once deemed untreatable were now being treated. So Big Pharma put the underworld and the topside world in the same bottle. However, one of the most powerful things to reach consumer hands in all of history came out during this transit. It was called Enovid, a 100% effective birth control pill when taken as directed. I think of Enovid as the embodiment of this transit. Pluto is sex and reproduction. Virgo's drive is independence. Thanks to Enovid, you could have intercourse if you wanted, and yet not find yourself bound to someone else through a baby. Your life's trajectory no longer had to be disrupted. You could have as much sex as you wanted, and yet, like the Virgin, you could still stand alone. When Pluto entered the intellectual earth sign of Virgo, a tsunami of innovation, the likes of which no one could ever have imagined hit the West. At 0 degrees of Virgo, Pluto brought in the microchip. At 1 degree, NASA was formed. Then a satellite went into space. A manned spacecraft orbited Earth, and by the time Pluto was in late Virgo, Neil Armstrong was walking on the moon. The space age and the computer age were officially upon us, and so was Virgo's favorite word, analysis. Computer science was based upon analysis, but we saw this happening within the social sciences as well. Pluto in Virgo offered to the public, both teachers and leaders, who could articulate what had been unspoken. People now had words to use. There were defined identities they could adopt. There was finally an explanation as to why things felt so bad on a personal level. Without the ability to articulate grievances and solutions, people could not have gone forward. One last thing. I really didn't say much about the women's movement during this transit. The women's movement owes its vigor and energy to the civil rights movement of Pluto in Virgo. We see its nascent stirrings, yes, but the women's movement actually belongs to Pluto in Libra. So next we'll explore what Pluto did as it moved through Libra's domains: love, marriage, relationships, and the law. Pluto in Libra, 1971 to 1984. The zeitgeist of Pluto in Libra was to ferret out inequality and destroy it. And if there was a time in history when this could be accomplished, it was during Pluto in Libra. If you look at the marches of the suffragettes 100 years earlier, you see something striking. Nearly all of the marchers were white. Now women wanted more than the vote. They wanted total equality in every way. And thanks to the civil rights advances of the previous transit, Pluto in Virgo, women of all colors and backgrounds and sexualities could join forces. Demonstrations and sit-ins did go on, but Pluto in the legal sign of Libra was obsessed with changing laws. One of the earliest fights during Pluto in Libra was the Equal Rights Amendment. This amendment guaranteed equal rights to all American citizens regardless of sex, and it was used everywhere to galvanize feminists. The workplace was rife with inequities. Women weren't paid as much as men for the same exact work. Preference was always given to men when hiring. A woman could be fired for getting pregnant. A boss chasing a secretary around the desk was still portrayed as a joke in cartoons. No laws protected women from sexual harassment. Likewise, women couldn't get a credit card without a male signing for it. Women couldn't get a home loan without a male co-signer. Spousal rape was legal. This list truly goes on and on. Pluto's struggles are grueling, and just when you think you've gotten to the bottom, you find yet another layer of the power structure. Women had a major win in the courts with Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court found that surgical abortion was a woman's choice under the right to privacy. That makes a lot of sense if you think of the transit overseeing this event. Pluto is privacy, and Libra is the law. Once that ruling came down, we all breathed a sigh of relief because it had finally been decided and we would never have to discuss it again. The women's movement did a good job in opening the way. Consciousness was changed, and laws were put in place so people couldn't just do anything they wanted anymore when it came to employment, compensation, and opportunity. By the time Pluto was in late Libra, Margaret Thatcher had become the first female Prime Minister of England. Geraldine Ferraro was the first presidential running mate. Sandra Day O'Connor was sworn in as the first female justice of the Supreme Court, and Sally Ride became the first female astronaut. These may seem like small steps forward, but through the ages, women have been so severely underrepresented in positions of authority and influence that these advances actually meant a lot. During this transit, another Libran issue had to be transformed, and that was relationships. The women's movement brought male-female partnerships into the spotlight. In particular, the special relationship Libra rules, marriage. Pluto destroys what it touches, and in the 1970s, it destroyed quite a few marriages. That can be traced directly to the implementation of the no-fault divorce. Diplomatic Libra said irreconcilable differences were enough of a reason to break up. You didn't have to prove your partner had done anything terrible anymore. So divorce rates doubled between the time Pluto went into Libra and the time it left. As I've said before, the air signs are modern, so Pluto in any air sign brings a modern spirit of the times. In the air sign Gemini, Pluto sped up the world with modern technology. In Libra, Pluto brought a modern way of looking at love. Now that women didn't have to be totally dependent upon men financially, and sex didn't have to result in pregnancy, the age-old constraints were gone. As Pluto moved through Libra, ideals about love changed like this. Any consenting person who had reached the age of majority should be able to love any other consenting person openly and freely. All the things that used to be off limits were now in play. Cohabitation, sex outside of marriage, sex without love, sex with love, sex with multiple partners, even love and sex between members of the same gender was gaining traction. Pleasure for the sake of pleasure came into vogue, meaning there weren't as many taboos about what kind of sex to have. Dozens of sex manuals came out, and many of them finally focused on female sexual satisfaction to bring in a much-needed equilibrium. Libra is the sign of the Zodiac that is most open to love in all its forms and relationships in all their forms. Libra learns a lot about love through openness and experimentation. With Pluto here, that happened in mass. As a whole, people tried various arrangements to find out what was best for them. Some became swingers for life. Others settled down with one partner for life. This movement was about deliberation and choice. Now, because we're talking about Pluto, we have to stick with collective experiences. This brings us, as it always does with Pluto, to mass media. There was a significant change in mass media because the world was indeed changing. Libra values when things are nice, balanced, beautiful, and aesthetically pleasing. When Pluto moved through Libra, there was a loss of those ideals. The Watergate scandal was an overarching event. People at the time were quite innocent about the highest executive office in the land. The public expected a certain reverence for the office and from it. Then it came out that the man behind the desk was a criminal. He was not only behind a break-in and burglary, he bugged Democratic headquarters and then used the CIA to obstruct justice. Tapes surfaced that revealed his crimes and he resigned. This event proved on a large scale that a moral and ethical decay was going on in the United States. You see, the crime rate during Pluto in Libra was notoriously high. Mass media carried one story after the next about robberies and beatings. You didn't even have to be doing anything risky anymore to get hurt. Take the Tylenol murders. People bought Tylenol at the drugstore and were poisoned with cyanide. It was no longer safe to buy aspirin. That Halloween, the pixie stick killer poisoned children with pixie sticks. Later, it turned out that a father did it to kill his own children, but the coverage gave people ideas, and razor blades were found in candied apples. Pins were discovered in candy bars. Pluto in Libra brought a miasma of fear to buying something at the drugstore and going trick-or-treating. Things that used to be nice and worry-free were now tainted. Halloween candy now had to go through an X-ray machine, and that was just the beginning. This transit also saw the most mass murders ever. It saw the most serial killers with the highest body counts ever, dwarfing even today's statistics. Here are a few of the more famous examples. Charles Manson and family went on a killing spree that included a pregnant actress. The Zodiac killer was, at exactly the same time, terrorizing San Francisco. John Wayne Gacy, the clown, raped and murdered at least 30 boys and collected their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. David Berkowitz was committing murders in New York, and in California, the Hillside Strangler was on the loose. There were even 3 famous cases of family annihilators during the era Pluto in Libra. These were fathers and husbands. They looked like they were living normal lives, but suddenly killed everyone they were supposed to love. Ted Bundy was on his own rampage at this time. He personified Pluto in Libra in that he looked attractive, but turned out to be deadly. There are some serial killers whose appearance alone would turn anyone in the other direction. Cold, bugged-out eyes and bad teeth would be all you needed. The most unsettling thing about Ted Bundy was that he was nice-looking, charming, articulate, smart. He was educated, and he even wore a fake cast to give the impression that he was harmless. And yet he was one of the worst mass murderers in U.S. history. The Green River Killer, who terrorized Seattle, was a married man with a good job and a child who was active in his church. Through these 2 men, Pluto in Libra brought us a hard truth, and that was, you can't trust what you see. A terrible underworld can be lurking beneath aesthetics that look perfectly fine. This is the dark side, the very, very dark side of the Pluto in Libra transit. The general public couldn't see all this without a growing unease. They questioned the ability to live normally and safely in such a world. But the one that really seemed to change everything was the case of Adam Walsh. His mother did what all our mothers did back then. She left her son to play with the toys while she went shopping for a lamp in the next apartment. He was lured away by a sadistic pedophile. Adam was tortured, raped, and his head was found in a drainage canal. When Pluto was in late Libra, a film was made about Adam. It aired twice on TV and was watched by 60 million horrified people. Adam was in the collective psyche, as was the then unknown killer. This is when education began for parents and children. Programs on stranger danger came to the schools. Malls started to automatically lock down with a missing child report. As I've said before, all of the air signs managed to uphold a certain naivete. Pluto through Libra brought a shattering of that naivete, and the murder of Adam Walsh seemed to be the tipping point in that process. A plutonic shift in consciousness can be very ugly, but shift it must. There was also a shift in mass media now. Back in the 1960s, the movie Psycho was as bad as it got. There was a woman in the shower, then the film cut to a knife, then they filmed some Bosco going down the drain. Violence was suggested but not shown. In the era of Pluto in Libra, slasher films were born. Why would that happen? Because Pluto destroys what it touches. In Libra, it destroyed the decorum and subtlety that Libra so loves. Violence became extremely graphic, as in the movies Friday the 13th, Halloween, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Special effects had advanced, so now a filmmaker could portray a knife blade opening up a jugular vein and blood pouring out. We saw stabbings, dismemberments, and beheadings. In Libra, Pluto brought the extreme opposite of beauty, and that's gore. And what wasn't gory was just plain scary. In Jaws, a shark terrorizes a quiet summer beach town. In The Exorcist, a sweet, loving little girl's childhood becomes a torture chamber with the devil himself at the helm. Pluto in Libra said, "Be careful what you think is pretty. Be careful what you think is nice. It might be dangerous everywhere you step." And what about diplomacy? That is a major association with Libra. Well, I already talked about the "it was nobody's fault" divorce. The foreign policy of the American government was the same. The Pluto in Libra era was overwhelmingly about peace and diplomacy over war. It might even be said that peace at any cost was the spirit of the time. Pardons and gifts were given, and there was a turning away from both direct conflicts and significant violations of human rights. This was the only thing America seemed to want after the long and messy war in Vietnam. So, did Pluto change everything associated with Libra? Yes. Pluto always changes every facet of the sign it's in. With the planet of death in the sign of beauty, beauty ideals changed dramatically. Female beauty went from curvy and feminine and voluptuous to models who looked like they were dying of anorexia. The curves and breasts were gone in favor of looking like a little boy. It's no coincidence that as women earned greater power in the world, the body ideal changed to erase the signs of womanhood. You see, Libra is given to counterbalance. When one pan rises, the other falls. When Pluto is involved, There's usually something destructive about that counterbalance. In this case, the new underweight ideal was a collective reaction to the rise of women, an attempt to keep women small and controllable, to keep them underfed and obsessed with a goal that is impossible if you have any other responsibilities or interests in life. Why didn't women just reject this image? We're talking about advertising, which bypasses the rational mind and appeals to the lizard brain. You can look at a picture in Vogue, not think it's particularly attractive, and yet close the magazine feeling fat. A diet industry quickly mushroomed around this new ideal, grabbing the equal pay out of women's wallets. Pluto in Libra brought a general toxicity to beauty, and yet Pluto has an ulterior motive. This ideal has been an inspiration for women to look for inner beauty, to see with their own eyes, and get in touch with their own sensibilities about beauty. In fact, it's been a topic of conversation ever since. Pluto in Libra was an intense and interesting time. The next transit would not have been possible without it. Niceties and decorum had to be put aside, and ideals had to be dispelled. A certain cynicism had to descend upon our culture in order for Pluto in Scorpio to do its work. That's another story, and it's coming up next. Pluto in Scorpio, 1984 to 1995. Pluto in Scorpio was a quick transit of just under 12 years, so it got down to business right away and caused massive changes in Scorpio's domains: sex, death, and power. Let's begin with sex. Pluto in Libra brought sex out of the closet, but Pluto in Scorpio pushed the boundaries and shattered the remaining taboos. There was a sexualizing of nearly all media. In fact, this was when the term gratuitous sex was born. It seemed that no matter where the story was going, characters ended up with their pants around their ankles because it made everything look cooler, not because it helped the storyline. Madonna simulated masturbation on stage in the Blonde Ambition tour, and Tina Turner asked in a cynical tone, "What's love got to do with it?" While the movie 9.5 Weeks introduced America to S&M, sex was a regular topic of conversation on the talk shows that were proliferating on television. We learned about open relationships, bisexuality, transsexuality, and swinging. But this planet cannot move through a sign like Scorpio without digging down under the superficial, sensational layer, looking for something meaningful. When Pluto was at 1 degree of Scorpio, out came a popular film called Something About Amelia. Media was on the verge of changing. The early degrees of Pluto in Scorpio were still a time when most people got their entertainment from television alone. A well-advertised, made-for-TV movie could bring in an enormous audience. Something About Amelia, starring Glenn Close, is about a live-in biological father who's molesting his pubescent daughter. The mother doesn't believe her at first, but then realizes it's true, and there's another daughter who could soon be in danger. This might be a regular topic of all manner of shows now, But when Pluto hit Scorpio, this was a shocking, taboo-breaking tale. It profiled the seductive undercurrents in a family. It focused on the psychological trauma caused not only to the child, but to the entire family system. Something about Amelia then went into the recovery of the child, the psychological aftercare. This story showed what could be slithering under the guise of what looked like a normal middle-class family. The next 11 years focused on sex, but included a constant conversation about the sea of sexual trauma out there. Because one rapist or one pedophile can have hundreds of victims, statistics say that sexual violation has happened to more of us than it hasn't happened to. Something about Amelia was just the beginning of a cultural dive into sexual crimes, into recovery from abuse, and into self-help culture. That means a culture where therapies no longer carry stigma, and most people know at least a little something about their dysfunctions. This introspective sign also brought a national campaign in which mental illness was discussed openly for the first time, because Scorpio isn't just associated with our deeper emotions. It's associated with emotional pathology. The young of today may not know this, but there was a time when people didn't talk about these things because they didn't have the vocabulary to do so. Pluto in Scorpio gave us a lexicon for abuse and for recovery. For example, back when Pluto was in Cancer, a person might say, "My mother liked her wine." By the end of Pluto in Scorpio, a person could say, "My mother was an absentee alcoholic." Back when Pluto was in Cancer, people would whisper that a girl had a funny uncle. By the end of Pluto in Scorpio, the girl herself could say, "I was sexually violated by my uncle and have trouble with intimacy because of it." This graphic sign brought in terminologies that we have only added to since. Pluto focuses on personal power, and in order to grab hold of your power, you have to identify and explore whatever made you feel powerless. This was also the time when a brand new danger surrounded sexuality. During Pluto in the late degrees of Libra, cases of AIDS began to occur. But that didn't yet fall under the stewardship of Pluto because it appeared to be local, and it appeared to only affect the gay community. When Pluto entered 0 degrees of Scorpio, it was official. There were cases of AIDS in every country in the world. In no time, the virus had spread into the entire earthly population: straight men, straight women, children, newborns. AIDS meant that you would lose your immune system. You would be host to strange fungus and cancers. You would turn into a shade of your former self, and then you would die. It was only 2 decades between the time the pill came out and the time AIDS presented itself. We can only imagine what those 20 carefree years were like. People who came of age as Pluto moved into Scorpio entered a world of AIDS death, AIDS activism, and news about who had contracted the disease. As Pluto moved deeper into Scorpio, Retroviral medicines hit the market. They weren't very effective in the beginning, but they constituted hope. And by the time Pluto left Scorpio, every state in the Union had passed mandates for AIDS education. What exactly that consisted of depended upon the state and the district. Some taught thorough sex education, while others decided to go with abstinence. But everyone had to acknowledge that sex and AIDS existed. We have to deal with yet another issue concerning Pluto in Scorpio: scandals, and a sweeping change in how scandals were presented to the masses. Pluto in Libra had already done away with decorum. Now Pluto in Scorpio was able to get into the nitty-gritty. So when the famous televangelist Jimmy Swaggart began having regular sex with a streetwalker, we got all the details. They met at a cheap hotel. He was extremely quick. Then he'd drop the used condom on the carpet and drive off in his town car. The prostitute story was hard to avoid, and clips of Jimmy Swaggart's tearful admissions were on every station. It was dramatic. He wept as he admitted he had sinned against God, against his wife and his family. He cried especially hard in admitting that he had sinned against his church. That church had, after all, given him a net worth of $150 million. Pluto and Scorpio are both about power, which includes bringing down people in power. Jimmy Swaggart took an ugly fall from on high, and yet that scandal was small potatoes in comparison to the next one and the next. There was actually an acceleration in the realm of scandals. This acceleration can be traced to the Cable Act of 1984. Pluto had just ingressed into Scorpio when the Cable Act deregulated the industry in every way, on every level of government. Billions of dollars flowed in from all directions, so by the time Pluto was in late Scorpio, America was wired in a totally unprecedented way. With every wire came another channel, another person in the loop, and endless hours of air to fill. Pluto used that new platform to express the nature of Scorpio, revealing what is behind the curtain, uncovering the secrets people would prefer to keep to themselves. As cable reached into more and more households, scandals began to have an obsessive quality. How about the Clarence Thomas hearings? He was being vetted to be a Supreme Court justice when a law clerk named Anita Hill finally told the story of working with him. He liked to tell her about pornographic films, especially the kinds of scenes he liked best. He said his penis was much larger than average. He also asked Anita Hill out and pressured her for reasons when she declined. He bragged about the pleasure he gave women during oral sex, shared his thoughts on the size of the perfect breast, and told her which outfits made her look more or less sexually appealing. After inviting Ms. Hill to watch a porno called Long Dong Silver and getting no as an answer, he demanded to know who had placed a pubic hair on top of his can of Coke. Thomas's other accusers were never questioned by the Senate, so it was easy for him to weasel out. In front of the Senate panel, he banged the table and called the whole thing a high-tech lynching. He was right about the high-tech part. Every sentence, at least from the people who were allowed to speak, was aired 24 hours a day. Why is Scorpio driven to reveal the truth in this way? Well, that has to do with Scorpio's disdain for neutrality. Once you know the details of a story, a strong visceral reaction usually comes up, and then it's easy to pick a side. This is the experience Pluto gave the masses during its visit to Scorpio. The nature of Pluto, like the nature of Scorpio, is to take stock, to show what's there, even if it makes you queasy, even if it makes you cynical. Scorpio probes, Pluto digs. So while the hearings may have been unpleasant, sexual harassment in the workplace became a serious topic of discussion for the very first time. Women who were pressured at work and grossed out by bosses or supervisors now knew what to call it, and they also knew they weren't alone. But Scorpio isn't associated only with sexual power plays. It's associated with all power plays. When Rodney King was beaten within an inch of his life by police in Los Angeles, that was on camera too, and it could be played hundreds of times on all manner of programming. That's why when the cops who beat him were acquitted, 5 days of rioting ensued. Everyone had seen the beating. Anyone who needed their memory refreshed could have it refreshed by turning on the TV. And there was another lesson to be learned. Don't trust people just because they're in high places. Yet another development during Pluto in Scorpio was the war on drugs. The war on drugs came into modern collective awareness when Pluto ingressed into Scorpio, because that's precisely when crack hit the streets. The crack epidemic was known to the masses because it was talked about on the news, and even President Reagan made a public service announcement. He said, if you use it, stop it. And if you don't use it, never try it. The euphoria from crack is extreme and short, and it results in deep cravings. Any craving so deep that it makes you hurt yourself is Scorpio's domain, as is the loss of personal choice that comes with crack addiction. Nancy Reagan went into the schools with an anti-drug campaign that immediately became the Just Say No tour. Just Say No was never going to override the circumstances, personal undercurrents, and biological mechanisms that cause drug use. But nobody in Washington could be against the war on drugs. We are talking big money. So much money that it got tied up in foreign relations and military funding. So many billions are still at stake. The war on drugs is likely never going to end. And it's taught us a lesson that Pluto tries to teach us again and again. Whatever you stuff in the basement always ends up on the front lawn. In other words, anything you repress intensifies. The more repression you put on drugs, the more valuable drugs become. The more valuable they become, the more violence will surround their import and distribution. Drugs are always associated with cartels and violent gangs because only the most hardened criminals are willing to take the risk. Repression makes any problem worse in the long run. The crack epidemic had already decimated the inner cities. The war on drugs compounded that problem through high rates of imprisonment for inner city dwellers. The war on drugs might be called the war on the poor because the punishment for crack cocaine was 10 times harsher than the punishment for the same amount of powdered cocaine used by the brokers on Wall Street. This is just one of the things that caused a power differential in American society. There was also a dramatic, ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor. When Pluto entered Scorpio, the minimum wage was $3.35. 11 years later, when Pluto left Scorpio, minimum wage had increased to only $4.25. That's a 90-cent difference. In other words, minimum wage rose 8 cents per year for 11 years, while the average rent went up 40% and the average college tuition rose by 150%. The answer was not to raise wages or to lower tuition. It was to make a nation of borrowers. The credit card industry began to boom under Scorpio. Credit gave people the impression that they were richer than they were, that anyone could have anything. This attitude leaked out into mass media. A popular movie called Wall Street encapsulated it all. A billionaire named Gordon Gekko makes a speech to billionaire wannabes in which he says in all seriousness, with his index finger up in the air, "Greed is good." Here we have the dark core of Pluto in Scorpio. As I've mentioned before, Scorpio is the most desirous sign in the zodiac, the sign most associated with the id, the instincts, our deepest unquestioned wants. During this transit, greed was systemic. American tax dollars were used by corporations to make profits they didn't share back with us. The stock market was unregulated, so there was high-risk use of other people's money. Taxes dropped for corporations and the highest income earners, and offshore untaxed accounts thrived. In this greed is good environment, there emerged a new kind of corporate takeover called the hostile takeover, in which the gobbling up of smaller companies by larger ones resulted in death. The death of factories, the death of communities, the death of towns. It was called a hostile takeover because the people who lived there didn't want their town to die. They often fought against it, but almost never won. It didn't matter who had the House or the Senate or who was in the White House. There were 3 different men and 2 different parties in the Pluto in Scorpio years. All politicians work on the same side, for the moneyed interests, and they all lie just the same. And yet, despite all of this, America looked very good from the outside. Overseas, the communist system was falling quickly and dramatically. America seemed a shining example of Western life when looked at in contrast to the failing, crumbling USSR. In mundane astrology, the Soviet Union was a Scorpio sun. When Pluto in Scorpio crossed over that sun, Mikhail Gorbachev brought glasnost to the communist empire. Glasnost means openness and transparency and freedom of information. The secret scorpionic ways of the USSR was no more. The Soviet satellite countries got out from under Mother Russia, and the Iron Curtain came down in East Berlin. The most famous symbol of Soviet oppression, the Berlin Wall, was gone. And that also meant the Cold War was officially over. Technology continued to advance during this transit of Pluto through Scorpio. We got fax machines and the Hubble telescope. And video games were in enough homes to be called a collective obsession. But cell phones were still huge, and very few people had them. Personal computers were only in 8% of households, and the internet was in its nascent beginnings. The first search index, called Jerry and David's Guide to the World Wide Web, existed, but was yet to be named Yahoo. Bill Gates was making the rounds on late night television talking about what the internet was and how it differed from radio or a video recorder. With Pluto at 29 degrees and 59 minutes of Scorpio, we were teetering on the precipice. But virtual reality belongs to Pluto in the expansive, unlimited sign of Sagittarius, which is the subject of the next section. Pluto in Sagittarius, 1995 to 2008. The sign of Sagittarius is the archer, whose arrow points up at the sky. Sag stands for foreign lands and new horizons. Sag is the explorer, the globetrotter. Pluto, on the other hand, is transformation, in this case, on the level of the collective. The major transformation that occurred during the transit of Pluto through Sag was the creation of a brand new cosmos, otherwise known as the Internet. Let's not forget that as Pluto left Scorpio, the Internet was not part of daily life for most Americans. Not even 1 in 10 households had a computer, and the web was just starting to pop. When Pluto moved into Sagittarius, the first search engine was christened with the name Yahoo. Now we could get around in an organized way, dragging and clicking. At the core of Sagittarius is the desire to expand. So naturally, Pluto in Sag transformed the West with a very, very expansive new reality, a virtual reality. As expected with Sag, excesses and indulgences of all kinds arose too. Sag loves a dopamine rush, and the internet supplied that rush. Now that people were dialing up, they were getting into excessive game playing, excessive working, excessive surfing, excessive stimulation. Video sharing platforms, auction sites, and early social media only cranked up the dopamine. Most of the transformations that came with Pluto in Sagittarius were directly or indirectly related to the growth of the internet. We saw a leap forward in globalization. There's nothing new about globalization per se. People have always struck out and explored new terrain from the beginning. Paleoarchaeologists have dug up 15,000-year-old arrowheads in New Mexico made from stone that originated in the mountains of Washington state. Many people through the ages have died half the world away from where they were born. But the globalization that took place during Pluto in Sagittarius was on a totally different level of bigness. At the very beginning of this transit, the whole computer-based realm was referred to as the information superhighway. That was the most comfortable way to explain the situation to people who grew up on rotary phones. In no time, dial-up became Wi-Fi, and phone lines became fiber optic cables and satellite networks. Pluto in Sag allowed for the kind of globalization we think of today. That means political, economic, and cultural exchange among peoples and nations that make the world not only interconnected, but also interdependent. Trade, investment, ideas, and inventions spread like wildfire in this new environment. But we must understand that for every leap forward Pluto brings, it can cast a shadow. And as Pluto moved into just 1 degree of Sag, its shadow was signed into law. This may sound a little esoteric and a little dry, but the intellectual dimension of Sag is known to do that. And what I'm about to say had a powerful impact. I'm talking about the Telecommunications Act of 1996. The point of this act was for America to be first, to not only succeed, but lead in the new digital age. Behind the scenes, the mass media lobby was so influential and so willing to make so many contributions that this act was supported by nearly the entire House and nearly the entire Senate on both sides. Any president's signature was assured, and at the time, that office was held by Bill Clinton. This act did away with restrictions that had been in place since 1934 about what constituted news. Pure opinion programs could be presented as news. Media companies could use a beautiful set that looked and sounded just like a newsroom, but they no longer had to employ journalists or cover original stories. Opinion could look like news, sound like news, call itself news, but it didn't have to be news anymore. This act contained language that meant fairness and accuracy were no longer required either. Film no longer had to be the correct film for the topic, and tape could be chopped up to give any impression. In other words, the nature of the content no longer had to be disclosed, but an even darker shadow was cast by this act. There was no longer any limit as to how many newspapers, radio stations, television stations, and cable channels one company or even one individual could own. Since 1934, multiple owners kept media honest. Because they were rivals, they watchdogged each other in hopes of discrediting each other. That competition protected consumers. But that became a thing of the past with the Act of 1996. Pluto stands for power and influence, which includes mass media. Sagittarius stands for expansion. So as soon as they were allowed, media outlets began gobbling up other media outlets. There was a flurry of mergers that meant just a few became bigger and bigger and bigger. Today, there are only 6 owners. They own every station on radio, cable, and broadcast television. They also own the major newspapers. One company with thousands of stations has a very long reach. It can select the topic, set the terms, create the debate, frame the presentation, and even answer itself. By that I mean one outlet can play both sides, acting as if there are 2 sides being aired when in fact it's all just one blob. This creates a closed loop where their newspapers can support what's said on their radio stations, which can support what is said on their digital television stations. They can seem to be involved in a vigorous exploration of a topic, but one corporation is putting out all the data. 6 entities control reality in what amounts to a gigantic shell game. The reason Pluto is associated with mass media is because it holds such power. During Pluto in Sag, that power only expanded. It makes sense that Pluto in the sign of philosophy would have an exaggerated effect on the philosophy of the masses. Well, it did. And one of the reasons for that was very simple: excessive use. During this transit, there was a jump in the amount of mass media people consumed. The average when Pluto entered Sag was 7 hours a day. By the time Pluto left Sag, the average was 11 hours per day. And because mass media is a culture-shaping, belief-shaping, philosophy-shaping force, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 made mass media a disempowering force. It came to be that the audience had little exposure to unbiased information, expertise, or people espousing truly free thought. Let's turn to another part of Sagittarius: religion. Religion is under the purview of this sign because it's about big ideas. Religion is a combination of both laws and beliefs. It attempts to answer the question, where does my little life fit in the grand scheme of things? Then we have Pluto. Pluto is heavy. It represents struggle, death, a steely will, and modern warfare. So what happens when we put these 2 things together? If the expression is positive, unshakable faith. But during this transit, the placement manifested collectively as philosophical and religious extremism. That includes beliefs a person is willing to die for. But here I am talking about terrorism. Terrorism means that the crime is motivated by extreme ideas, and the act is meant to garner attention and evoke fear. We saw domestic terrorism rise during this transit with stadium and abortion clinic bombings. But since we're talking about Sag, I want to focus on international terrorism, terror with a global context. First, there were 2 bombings of US embassies overseas. But when Pluto was halfway through Sag, there was a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. The attack was attributed to Al-Qaeda. This attack hit the most plutonic power symbol in the United States, skyscrapers that symbolized Western wealth and Western power. That day, terrorism permeated the collective mind. It began to be perceived as a geopolitical force, a danger now and in the future. The response to the attack was plutonic as well, instinctual. A war on terror was launched. During this time, the government, plutonic entity that it is, did what Sag always does. It expanded. It got considerably larger, especially through the development of the Department of Homeland Security. Likewise, under the guise of fighting terrorism, the government gave itself more power to violate the privacy of the citizenry and crush long-standing freedoms. That 350-page document was called the Patriot Act. Let's talk about another facet of Sagittarius, gambling. This fire sign enjoys risk and craves prosperity, so wagering is a natural inclination for the ninth sign. When Pluto entered Sag, it brought internet gambling. The first real money bet placed online was the day Pluto reached 1 degree of Sag. However, for wagering on a scale worthy of Pluto, we must look at the US stock market. The trouble is that when you put the planet of destruction in the sign of risk-taking, prosperity might just take a tumble. This event was called the Great Recession because it was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. An unregulated market and the risky trading of bad mortgages caused house prices to plummet, bringing the stock market down too. The banks couldn't cover their projections and couldn't undo their decisions. They wanted a taxpayer bailout. Despite Americans calling their representatives at a rate of 500 to 1 against the bailout, George Bush rustled up about $500 billion overnight because how's this for Pluto in Sag? The banks were considered too big to fail, too big to die. Deep within Pluto's character is a craving for each soul to pay for what it has done. Pluto never let anyone out of the underworld because they gave him a sob story. The collective felt betrayed and exploited, in particular because there was no effort whatsoever to break up the banks. The banks got their money, the CEOs got their bonuses, and we got nothing except for an honest look at how things work at the top. It's just a good thing Pluto in Scorpio had thickened our collective skin and left a veneer of cynicism. Still, Pluto in Sag was not an easy transit. Any planet in Sag can get out of hand. However, there is a creative side, an easy, breezy imagination. Sag is compelled to go farther and deeper and higher than it's been before. Pluto in Sag did indeed leap forward, just as you would expect from a visionary fire sign. As a collective, we all enjoyed watching the inventions pour out. The hybrid car, the Palm Pilot, flash drives. You could chat with an old friend from high school that you looked up on MySpace. On Google, you could find a new restaurant or a new lover. And what about DNA testing? You could finally know where on Earth your genes really came from. And we weren't even limited to Earth. During Pluto in Sagittarius, we got to see the completion of the International Space Station. Stardust mission collected particles from the air around a moving comet, and 2 rovers actually landed on Mars. We have come a long, long way since the first plane took off during Pluto in the sign of Gemini. We've also come to the end of this retrospective. As you can see, each Pluto generation brought special circumstances and special tasks. And people born during a generation do carry that zeitgeist within them for the rest of their lives. It's expressed as a member of that generation, yes, but it's also expressed individually in the natal wheel, depending upon the sign placement, the house placement, and the relationships it makes to other planets. I offer full astrological services, so come see me for a birth chart reading. You can find me on Facebook at Cosmic Arts Astrological Services, or drop me a line at cosmicartsastrologicalservices@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to Secrets from an Astrologer's Desk, the Pluto Generations. I'm Joy. More astrology to come.